Today marks the 25th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Tonight we look back to remember how this long war began and the effects that changed history forever.
I am Cyan Doyer.
I'm Will Bittaker.
And I am Meredith Miera.
And this is Less Than 60 Minutes.
For our first point of discussion, here is Cyan Doyer explaining why the United States got involved in the war.
In the early years of the Vietnam War, President John F. Kennedy supported the increase in number of American military personnel in South Vietnam. Kennedy supported this due to the anti-communism containment policy that many of his predecessors had followed. After JFK's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson agreed that communistic behavior should not be tolerated. Johnson justified not the presence, but the escalation of American military forces based on four main factors. One was that America keeps her word against communism. Second, the future of all Southeast Asia was at risk. Thirdly, America's purpose was to keep peace among the nations. And fourth, the Vietnam War was a struggle for freedom. President Johnson said, "An Asia so threatened by communist domination would certainly imperil the security of the United States itself. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else." An important incident that contributed to U.S. involvement in this war was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd, 1964, the U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, was performing signal intelligence patrol and was pursued by three North Vietnamese Navy torpedo boats. The Maddox fired 3 warning shots and was then attacked with torpedoes and machine gun fire. This incident allowed for President Johnson to have the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country jeopardized by communist aggression. The brave soldiers fighting the war had many issues on the ground and in the air during this fight to end communism in Southeast Asia. Aerial difficulty during this war was due to many different factors. Fighter pilot Dick Anderegg, who fought in 170 missions, explained, "We had the wrong airplanes, the wrong weapons, and the wrong training for that kind of war." The North Vietnamese put rules in place forbidding the bombing of military and industrial targets in and around the enemy heartland. These restrictions gave major advantages to the North Vietnamese. Without the worry of attack, they were able to construct, with the help of their allies, the Chinese and the Soviets, an enormous anti-aircraft defense mechanism. This included MiG forces, SAMs, and AAA. The early warning radar systems, which countered the U.S. bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese lines. Missile reliance and performance was also a major issue for the United States. Over 1/2 of the missiles misfired or malfunctioned. The United States was also unable to use long-range missiles due to the rules of engagement stating that the U.S. Air Force had to have visual identification of the enemy aircraft before they could fire. Ground fighting was equally, if not more difficult for the U.S. soldiers. The North Vietnamese were fighting guerrilla warfare in difficult jungle terrain. Oftentimes, civilians of North Vietnam also joined the Viet Cong. Then, not only were the U.S. pressured to react quickly, but they also had to attempt to identify who was jumping out at them. Undoubtedly, the fight itself was difficult to endure for the United States troops. But out of the many troops the U.S. sent to Vietnam, many were young, inexperienced soldiers fighting against experienced soldiers protecting their homeland. The brave soldiers who took part in this treacherous fight are honored tremendously for the risks they took. Next, we have Meredith Miera to talk about the institution of the draft and Nixon's policies while he was in office.
Thank you, Cyan. The institution of the draft during the Vietnam War was controversial because many people did not agree with the causes or methods used in the war and many did not want to take part. But it did end up influencing many young Americans to volunteer so that they could choose their subdivision and would have less of a chance of being in an area where combat took place. Even though many were against the draft, young brave men lined up ready to fight for their country. Even though small groups were for the war, millions had issues against this war. We are now going to take it to Will for enlightenment about that.
Thank you, Meredith. And before I talk about the war opposition movement, I sat down with a local man who fought in the Vietnam War. Charles Phillips, a man who signed up for the war voluntarily, bravely fought for his country, and I had a chance to sit down with him and ask him a few questions.
So, what station were you? Started out in Quang, started out in Da Nang, then Chu Lai, and then after July, I went to Quang Tri. And then from Quang Tri, I went to Dong Ha. But in between Quang Tri and Dong Ha, I would fly out into the field wherever they need me. I was at LZ Saigon, Signal Hill, Marble Mountain, different places that they needed the Medicare. I'd be flown there and I'd stay there until a replacement would come along, and then I'd fly back to the 3rd Med Battalion where I was working in surgery.
Right. And what did you do while you were there? What was your
Coach Bank. And for when surgery got slow, when it wasn't bad, I went down to the cafeteria, not the cafeteria, it's cafeteria, but they call it the mess hall. And I was down there, the guy needed somebody to cook chicken, so I went down there and cooked chicken for various times for them, cooked chicken and eggs and whatever they needed done. They needed really need another chef, so I filled in until they got one in after a couple of weeks, flown them in from stateside.
And what was it like? So you were on the ground, I'm guessing.
Yes, right.
So,
Yeah.
Was it pretty hectic, running around all the time, or?
Sometimes it was, and when you went on patrols, you had patrols sometimes through the jungles and through that elephant grass, and they'd fly you in a place, and you'd be above that elephant grass. It looks nice up here from the sky, but when you jump down into that stuff, it's about 12 foot high.
Yeah.
You could land in that elephant grass, and there could be a tiger about 10 feet from you, and you would never see it.
Did you ever run into a tiger?
Well, they had a tiger attack one of the groups I was with over there. He picked up the biggest Marine in the outfit. He weighed about 230 pounds. And he put his teeth between his jugular and his carotid artery. And if it went a quarter inch either way, the man would have been dead. And I told him, I said, young man, you were lucky because the footprints on the paws are about that big on those Bengal tigers. And they're about that high. And they weigh about 400 pounds, and a distance between here and that pole over there. They were long. Yep, they're bigger than the ones you see in the zoos. Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Charles actually went further to explain that when the war was over, there would be signs reading, "Blacks go back, the fighting is over for you." And when he came home, he could still not go somewhere and get equal service, or could still not enter certain public facilities at all, even after he fought for his country. African Americans still weren't treated equally after they were in combat, and many of them were drafted. To pick up where I left off, the war opposition movement was one of the biggest movements ever against a war. From protests to sabotaging weapon deliveries and even filling the streets putting on shows to make fun of the fighting, these strong American citizens saw that there were big issues with the Vietnam War. Some war oppositions are just small groups who only want peace, but these Americans had many valid reasons to be against it. First, the Kent State shooting is a great example. Many people wanted to protest the war at Kent State University, but the Ohio National Guard tried to shut it down by shooting at the crowd because it got a little rowdy. 4 students were killed and 9 were injured. Right after that, strikes were started by students that closed down certain colleges and other universities nearby. Secondly, the My Lai massacre was a big upset. This U.S. attack on men, women, and children in the My Lai village really raised the number of protesters. This group of American soldiers brutally murdered over 500 people and even raped and mutilated many of the women and young girls. To make matters worse, the U.S. tried to keep it a secret until the press got wind of it. Finally, the Pentagon Papers really set these protesters off. Information was leaked that had proved saying that the U.S. government had been misleading the American people and lying about the progress of the Vietnam War for years. All these issues kept fueling the opposition movement and making them stronger and stronger until eventually the war reached a tipping point. Labor unions, government officials, church groups, and even middle-class families were outraged at the U.S. government for putting the country into the war. These American protesters, mostly led by college students, vowed to never let up unless a change was made. In January of 1973, they got their wish. The people's protest caused an end to the U.S. combat in Vietnam and a suspension of the draft. The people who took part in the opposition movement really changed the United States. Now we're going back to Meredith, who will be explaining one of the major attacks in the Vietnam War.
The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack from the Viet Cong rebels in North Vietnam on the south. It began on January 31st In 1968, the first day of Lunar New Year, which is considered Vietnam's most important holiday. This offensive was considered the turning point of the war. The motive for the attack was the heavy losses the North had taken from the U.S. and that Ho Chi Minh was not doing well and they needed a victory before he died. Now, while the U.S. was in the war, President Nixon had a certain plan that would be beneficial to our side. His policy during the war was Vietnamization. This policy consisted of building up South Vietnam forces and withdrawing U.S. troops to prepare the South to act in their own defense against the North while allowing the U.S. to leave with their honors still intact. Another aspect of this policy was to strengthen the South's government so they would be less vulnerable to communism. This policy was put into place because of the many lives that had been lost in the war with little progress against communism and helped for the U.S. to withdraw from the war. To wrap things up for this evening, Will be explaining how this long war came to an end.
Just like Barrett had said, the war did finally come to an end. Nixon's Vietnamization policy was used to try and put an end to the war, but even when he was withdrawing the U.S. troops, the fighting still continued. The North Vietnamese attempted a huge invasion of South Vietnam in 1972, but the South Vietnamese prevailed with the help of some U.S. war power. With thorough negotiations and the bombing of North Vietnam, a peace treaty was signed which was called the Paris Peace Accords. This treaty, signed in January of '73, stated that the U.S. military was completely withdrawn from Vietnam. This did not mean an end for the Vietnamese. They continued to fight until Saigon fell to the communists in 1975. The Vietnam War was a long war full of many different issues, and a country was divided. People were pro and anti-war constantly, fighting overseas and even in the United States. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I am Cyan Doyer.
I'm Will Bittaker.
And I am Meredith Miera.
See you next time on Less Than 60 Minutes.